Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another seminar on philosophy and international politics. Let me begin by saying how truly delighted we are to have with us tonight in the audience Professor Nicholas Onuf, a leading theorist in international relations and truly a legend in the field. We also are very pleased to welcome two distinguished guests, Professor Gunnar Hindrix, who will be speaking on the conditions of war, the English title of a fascinating book he originally wrote in German, which has just been published in Greek by Nissos Publication. The discussion after Professor Hindrix's lecture will be moderated by Assistant Professor Antonios Kaladzis. After the lecture, you are very welcome to address your questions to the speaker in Greek, English, or German. If you prefer in Greek, we will translate your question into English or German. So feel free to ask Professor Gunnar Hindrix about the context of lectures. We are all waiting to be very fascinating. Before we begin, allow me to share a few words about our two guests. Assistant Professor Antonios Kaladzis teaches modern European philosophy at the University of Ioannina. He studied political science and history at Pantheon University in Athens and received his PhD in philosophy from the Freie Universität Berlin in 2014 for a dissertation on Hegel's Science of Logic. Before joining the University of Ioannina, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Martin Buber Society of Fellows in the Humanities and Social Sciences at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem from 2013 to 2017. He later served as head of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, 2013 to 2017. He served as head of the interdisciplinary research group Dynamics and Experiences of the Global at the Center Mark Bloch. This is the German-French Center for Humanities and Social Sciences at Humboldt University in Berlin from 2017 to 2020. His research focuses on classical German philosophy, especially its systematic significance and its reception in contemporary philosophical debates. He is currently preparing a monograph on how Kant's perception of enlightenment has been interpreted and transformed from the late 18th century to today over time. As for our lecturer tonight, Professor Gunnar Hindrix, he was born in Wegberg, Germany in 1971. Since 2014, he has held the chair of history and philosophy at the University of Basel in Switzerland, succeeding Professor Emil Angel. He studied philosophy, history, and musicology at the Universities of Marburg, Tübingen, and Heidelberg. In 2007, he received the prize of the Heidelberg Academy of Science for his habilitation thesis, Das Absolute und das Subjekt. He has taught at the Universities of Heidelberg and Pennsylvania, and from 2022 to 2023 was a fellow at the prestigious Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. Professor Hindrix's research combines the history of philosophy and systematic philosophy. He is widely regarded as one of the most original and prolific contemporary German philosophers. His work brings metaphysics, theology, and classical German philosophy into a lively dialogue with today's philosophical discussions, and his thought is often associated with the so-called post-secular current in contemporary philosophy. Among his most important books are Das Absolute und das Subjekt, 2011, Die Autonomie des Klangs, eine Philosophie der Musik, 2014, Philosophie der Revolution, 2017, und Zur kritischen Theorie, 2020. His latest monograph, Abseits des Krieges, 2024, is the first of his works to appear in Greek in a translation by Theodoros Paraskevopoulos, published by Nissos Academic Publishing, as already said. And now to conclude my introduction, let me welcome Professor Hendricks and all of you in German with just a few words. Guten Abend. Im Rahmen des Seminars Philosophie und internationale Politik freuen wir uns sehr, heute den renommierten Professor Dr. Gunnar Hendricks begrüßen zu dürfen. Professor Hendricks hat kürzlich im Jahr 2024 sein bedeutendes Werk Abseits des Krieges veröffentlicht. Das Buch wurde ins Griechische übersetzt und vom Verlag Nissos herausgegeben. Heute haben wir das Vergnügen, einige seiner Gedanken hier am Institut für internationale Beziehungen zu hören und zu diskutieren. Herr Professor Hendricks, wir danken Ihnen herzlich für Ihre Anwesenheit. Sie haben das Wort, or in English, the floor is yours.
Maybe I will show you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Yorgos. Thank you for the kind words, Professor Evangelopoulos. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a couple of words. First of all, I would really like to thank Yorgos Evangelopoulos and Yorgos Xiropaidis, together with the Institute for International Relations, for hosting this event at this magnificent building. And today, after Vasilis Voutsaki's first talk in the series, I'm very happy as well to welcome Gunnar Hendricks. He's professor of history of philosophy, as Yorgos said, at the University of Basel, both to welcome him to Athens and to this lecture series. I would only like to add one point to Yorgos' excellent introduction to the work of the invitee. As Yorgos said, Hendricks is one of the most prolific and interesting contemporary philosophical figures in two discrete fields: history of philosophy and systematic philosophy. A couple of days ago, we had the pleasure to listen to his talk at the second Moisis Elisaf annual lecture for religion and philosophy in Ioannina. There, Hendricks gave a talk on Spinoza's account of imagination and on its political implications. The talk on Ioannina was thus more historically orientated. Today, we will have the opportunity to become acquainted with Hendricks' systematic thinking and much more with Hendricks' account of a highly contemporary and contested subject, the subject of war, and that of what Hendricks there describes in his book as this all-penetrating spirit of militarism. Speaking of Hendricks' book, I can't stress enough, how thankful we are, and me personally, to the great work and the efforts of Nissos academic publishers, and specifically to Paula Capola, who is together here with us. Without her assistance and effort, we wouldn't have the Greek translation of the book. So today it's a talk. It's a talk from Gunnar Hendricks' own war and the book presentation of his book that is just translated into Greek. As Yorgos said, after the talk, we'll proceed with the Q&A. Please feel free, to address the questions in whichever language you feel most comfortable. Professor Hendricks, dear Gunnar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Is that on? Okay. Thank you very much for having me here and for the all too kind words in the introduction, and especially thank you for translating my little booklet, which is more an extended essay than a philosophical treatise in the strict methodological sense. So it's for me, it was also an unusual booklet of mine for my own, within my own publications. What I will do now is a bit different again from the little book. For in that book, I try to dwell into different aspects that surround the concept of war. Aspects like right, power, self-preservation, and so on. What I decided to present here today is an other, doesn't it work? Oh, yeah, sorry, that's, is it better? No? Okay. Now? Hello. Better? Hello? No. Let's. Shall we try it without micro? I mean, unfortunately, I have a low voice, I have to say. That's always a problem. And if I don't have a micro, usually people after a while don't understand me, but we will try it. I could stand up, and perhaps it is better than I. Is it better standing? Talking to you standing? Okay. Actually, this fits to the talk because the talk is more political than my book. So the book is a philosophical investigation into war and certain concepts of war. And the essay that I want to read to you, or the considerations that I will present to you now, considerations that try to get at grip with the reality that surrounds us. Of course, from a philosophical perspective, but more political than I mean, more to the current politics than the book. So conditions of war is the title of my talk, not the conditions of war. So it's about several conditions of war without the claim that this is an exhaustive count of what conditions of war in our days. And it's specific about the war in the Ukraine and the relationship, perhaps spoken very much from a German perspective and my experience with German politics in reference to the Ukrainian war. I'll start now. The desolation of the Ukraine marks a new stage in the West's victory crisis. Surely, the war in the Ukraine is not the first war to have plagued Europe after the defeat of the socialist states. In contrast to the Yugoslavian wars, however, it has been accorded world historic significance. It is said to have ushered in a new epoch, or, in the words of former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, to have marked a Zeitenwende, a change of times. In the global South, this has been largely met with indifference, and from their standpoint, rightly so. From time immemorial, Europe has waged war within itself and the world. The lack of partisanship from outside Europe is therefore unsurprising. Within Europe, however, we are forced to question whether the war in the Ukraine really marks the dawn of a new era, whether moments of crisis are increasingly prompting military violence, and whether the West's victory crisis has intensified. How then are we, to speak with Hegel, to grasp our times in thought? First step. One thing is clear. The war in the Ukraine is not simply a war between two states. It is rather the point at which a far greater conflicts intersect. At first glance, it appears right stands opposed to might. The right to one state's self-determination is denied by another state. In order to protect it, further states intervene on behalf of it. Thus, states become intertwined. Upon second glance, however, power seems to stand opposed to power. For the defense of the right to self-determination requires forming an alliance, which meets power with power. This culminates in military aggression. Though the attacked state aims at self-defense, it does so by means of the allied states, thereby also realizing their aims. And these consist in the expansion of their own power, not simply in the defense of a state's self-determination. The Allied states are thereby bound together in the pursuit of power. The result of this is a hodgepodge of might versus right and power versus power. This narrative is a familiar one. It is partly the product of the belief in the liberal hegemony of right, partly the result of the focus of the alliances, enmities, and spheres of interests of the great powers. The tension inherent to this narrative has defined political thought since the 19th century, though now with the additional risk of nuclear warfare. One has long had reason to suspect, however, that this narrative is being told from the perspective of the great powers at war with one another. Though it accounts for key factors in international relations, it fails to articulate the paradigm within which these become meaningful. Could it not be the case that the world is structured differently now than it was? Carl Schmitt suggested such a different structure, which he called Großraumordnung, or large space order. Schmitt first proposed this theory in the 1930s in an attempt at thinking beyond liberal rights, the states and its spheres of interest. It was at this time that the German Reich sought to become the Great German Reich with a claim on Central Europe. The concept of a Reich, or an empire, however, could not be brought to align with the traditional concept of a state. Thus, some people cast it in terms of a resurrection of the pre-modern Holy Empire of the Middle Ages. But Carl Schmitt recognized such fantasies as a pipe dream. The prosaic concept of Großraum seemed much better suited to him. He thus coined a prosaic new legal term to refer to spatial units of organization arranged and governed by an empire. Schmitt's concept of Großraum carries with it several theoretical implications. Firstly, it no longer allows for sovereign equality of states as the foundation of international law. In the 17th century, the Peace of Westphalia had replaced the concept of a hierarchically structured Occident with that of equal legal subject of international law. In the 20th century, however, a new hierarchy was to be implemented. Empires, Reiche, occupy space in order to arrange states within their respective Großraum, and this requires asymmetrical international relations. Such new hierarchy does not reinstate the pre-Westphalian order, but rather surpasses it. For the Großraum order is a secular and modern organizational unit. Just like the economic Großraum of a metropolitan area, the large space of a metropolitan area, it is without transcendence and functional. So no holy empire. Secondly, the Großraum is based on Volk, on people and space, and therefore grounded in existence. It originates from a people's being. The right of a Großraum order is therefore not normative. Quite the opposite. It discards the normative structure of liberal rights. Norms are replaced in the Großraum by another concept of right, which Schmitt termed by the Greek word nomos. Nomos originates from the being of a people, whose empire organizes the Großraum. For this reason, the right of a Großraum is not arbitrary. It does not posit right, but precludes the possibility of new values that is implied by positive law. And last not least, The Großraum is not a sphere of interest of the great powers. Interests are at one's disposal, whereas being is not at one's disposal. So one must make a decision in favor of being. Obviously, such a concept was well suited for the specific Middle Europe strategies of the German Reich. Since the Kaiserreich, Germany had been in pursuit of them. Fascism raised them to a new level. According to Schmidt, the Großraum order had long been introduced, but outside of Europe. For exactly 175 years after the Pax Westphalica, in the year 1823, James Monroe had declared the USA protecting power of the American continent, the Monroe Doctrine. There were two spheres, one European, one American, and the former was not to involve itself in the affairs of the latter. In the Monroe Doctrine, Schmidt for the first time saw traces of a new concept of right surpassing that of the states. At its core, this concept prohibited the intervention of states considered raumfremd. These Schmidtian words are very difficult to translate into English. They have a certain order to it in a certain way. So the English literature also uses the German word, so I don't replace them by bad English translations, but try to give a short explanation always. So they are considered raumfremd or alien to a space. Which power is raumfremd and which is raumeigen, or which power is alien to a space or belongs to a space, is in turn explained by the existential foundation of the Großraum, namely its relationship to the being of a people. This too is not arbitrary. It results from being which has been decided upon. According to this account, Europe's great German Empire was merely making up for lost time. Its Großraum project was a modernization project in Schmidt's eyes. The concept of Großraum hereby became the key to a new post-Westphalian order. This development pushed the great powers and their spheres of interest, just like the liberal hegemony of the state, into the background. They still existed, but were to become functions of the new Großraum order. Also, Schmidt argues. Characteristic of the concept of a Großraum order is its existential foundation. In order to understand it, one must take into account Schmidt's political existentialism, of which the famous friend-enemy distinction is the articulation. The enemy takes the shape of our own question, Schmidt intends. He states clearly the objective of his incantation: the deduction of a thing's essence from its existence. The enemy is first to be differentiated according to his being. Only then can he confront us with our own question, to which one can answer with the delineation of one's own political stance. According to his being, in this case means, I quote Schmidt, to represent particularly intensely something existentially different and alien, as it relates, again Schmidt, to the real possibility of a killing. Under the extremum principle of annihilation, essence becomes the key to differentiating between friend and enemy. Concepts of political rationality, be they conservative, liberal, or socialist, therefore lose significance. Similarly, political interests become secondary in the light of this existential distinction. This distinction also determines the Großraum. From the substitution of norm by nomos, it follows that given existence takes precedence over posited essence, that the evolution of a people takes precedence over acquired citizenship, that spatial order takes precedence over equality before the law and the interplay of the great powers. According to Schmidt, the nomos sheds light on the friend-enemy distinction. Only in virtue of it can we and the existentially other be distinguished according to our being. Only by virtue of it can arbitrary norms and values be dispelled by concrete necessity. Only it enables a people to construct the Großraum order. The Großraum is therefore tied to the friend-enemy distinction. It is understood by political existentialism in relation to its extremum principle. Such is the nature between Großraum and war. Wars become explicable in terms of an existential foundation. They realize the extremum principle on the level of people, of the people, thereby surpassing the outdated concept of the state. Consequently, it would be inconceivable for a Großraum order, with its prohibition of foreign intervention, to condemn war. Rather, it depends on the possibility of war. For the identification of the enemy, which defines a Großraum's nomos and arises from an existential situation prior to any norms, interests, or values, can take place only within it. And yet, identifying the enemy merely requires the possibility and not the actuality of war. This leaves open the possibility of peace, understood as refraining from war. Schmidt here argues ex negativo. If the enemy was not determined existentially but essentially, he would no longer be an enemy according to his being, but to his essence. Making peace with him would thereby be rendered impossible, leaving open only the possibility of his annihilation. From this, it follows that supplanting the existential determination of the enemy with his essential determination would result in, as Schmidt calls it, discriminatory concept of war. Such a concept no longer allows for the enemy to be conceived of as being on the same level as oneself. The enemy becomes instead the criminal, the rogue, the devil, and no longer the enemy. Clearly, this precludes the possibility of refraining from war. Peace becomes an impossibility. Put differently, according to Schmidt, it is only possible to make peace with one's enemies. As soon as essence takes precedence over existence, or norm takes precedence over nomos, peace becomes impossible. The Großraum order thus claims to be able to secure peace by means of its prohibition of foreign intervention. 1945 saw the collapse of the German Reich. Its Großraum ambitions had reduced the continent to ash and rubble. There had been no sign of a non-discriminatory concept of the enemy, let alone peace. And only the intervention of raumfremde Mächte, of foreign powers, had put an end to the killing. This should have deflated the concept of Großraum. Was the model of sovereign equality to be reinstated? Not according to the followers of Schmidt. In their eyes, the great powers were now operating ideologically. At first glance, this seems to make no difference, as the German Großraum had also represented an ideology. The fascists understood this ideology, however, as stemming from the existence of a people. The Großräume or large space orders, which cropped up after 1945, were instead opposed to these existential foundations. In the name of liberalism and communism, they understood themselves as essentially rather than existentially grounded. In the eyes of Schmidt's followers, they thus represented the victory of norm over nomos, of values over being, of essence over existence. In order to become the global Großräume of the diverse people, oceans, and continents, the East and the West severed their ties to folk and Raum, to people and space, all in the name of a planetary ideology. Thus, the Großraum, as an alleged harbinger of peace, seemed to have been vanquished. A global civil war in the name of ideological values and norms was to take its place. In the 1950s, a young German student named Hanno Kesting put this into words. Thucydides had once proclaimed the losers of history to possess a special insight. It was in this vein that doctoral student from Heidelberg presented himself. He wanted to grasp the world historical situation in the wake of Germany's defeat. To this aim, he referred to Schmidt and formulated the global civil war of ideological Großräume. What is the background of this formulation? Schmidt's followers deemed the friend-enemy distinction to be the only means by which a civil war can be avoided. Because this distinction places less emphasis on questions of content, it submits ideological conflict to an external condition, namely the existential decision, thereby hindering the onset of the civil war, which is always ideological in the Schmidtian eyes. The ideologization of the Großräume by global liberalism and global communism seemed to destroy precisely this move. Both the East and West no longer acknowledged anything which transcends their conflicting values and norms. Rather, they accorded the implementation of these values and norms world historical significance. They were, respectively, to pave the way for a free world or for a global classless society. The planet is thus transformed into a Weltinnenraum, a world interior, in which ideological questions lead to conflicts, which in turn can only result in war. Such a war would necessarily be discriminatory, for it is ideologically determined, meaning the enemy is deemed a criminal or at least a wrong. Even international organizations, which were meant to contain war, were implicated in this, as they operate according to values and norms too, which is according to ideological discrimination. Such was the tragedy the concept of a global civil war evoked. For fear of it, Schmidt in 1945 had come up with a new nomos. This time it was to be the nomos not of the people, but of the entire planet. Multiple unideological ordered Großräume were to prevent the global warfare of ideologized Großräume. This was the counter-image to the normativity of the United States. Hanno Kesting's nightmare vision of global civil war, however, was more realistic than his master's revised concept of the nomos. And yet, a couple of decades later, even this vision had become obsolete following the collapse of the Soviet Großraum. The triumph of the West seemed to make way for a global constitution and global interior politics. Wars were considered as police interventions of a global society, or as violence directed towards it, which then would in turn prompt further global police interventions. To this day, this latter worldview, the anti-Schmittian worldview, remains largely intact. Schmidt's perspective, therefore, seems to have become irrelevant. But this merely seems to be the case. For one, these campaigns of global police interventions employ discriminatory conceptions of the enemy. They indeed target the enemies of a self-declared global society who act in opposition to its values and norms. Political forces are considered criminals, rogues, and outlaws. Here, Schmidt's critique of liberalism becomes relevant again. For another, the situation has become ever more complex throughout the years, as new Großräume besides this global society and its villainized states have emerged. They need not be defined either in terms of a people structuring Großraum or of conflicting ideologies. Instead, they display a range of both existential and essential grounds of determination. The Großraum as such, therefore, and this is my claim now, did not collapse along with the Großräume of liberalism and communism. Rather, problems surrounding the construction of Großräume in China, the European Union, and India are coming to the forefront, from which the original Großraum, that of the United States of America, cannot be spared. This does not bode well for securing peace. However, in order to get, and now I'm changing from the theory of a political right, Carl Schmitt's, to the theory of political left, namely the discussion that I will mention in a few seconds. However, in order to gain better overview, a different perspective on the global dimension of the matter at hand is required. At the beginning of the 21st century, German writer Robert Kurz, I think he's not known outside of Germany, but has considerable influence within Germany, spoke of a Weltordnungskrieg, or world order war. Recently, his exposition has been reissued. At a distance, it can be interpreted as an attempt at overcoming thinking in terms of world civil wars. Who was Robert Kurz? Until their eventual split, Kurz was the spokesperson of a small Marxist group called Crisis. Sorry. The Greek word, crisis, not the English word, crisis. Outside this close-knit milieu, he became known to the general public as the author of a book on the collapse of modernity. Hans Magnus Enzensberger, one of Germany's leading intellectuals for many, many years, published it as part of his book series Under the Bibliothek. It has since been reprinted. Kurz's book on the collapse of modernity interpreted the defeat of state socialism as the breakdown of Barak's socialism. Such Barak socialism was not the negation of capitalism, but consisted rather in a belated modernization of its peripheries. Furthermore, its collapse did not result in the triumph of world capital, but the exposure of its true crisis-prone nature. For there can no longer be anything, even apparently, external to it, in contrast to which it could euphemize its own contradiction. 13 years later, after this book that made Kurz famous, Kurz published a book. 13 years later, Kurz published a book with the title Weltordnungskrieg, World Order War. There he took stock of the consequences. He saw them expressed by intervention wars, crisis potentates, a global police force, the separation of the useful from the useless, the migrant crisis, the securing of resources, the privatization of the monopoly of violence, state of emergency, and 9/11. In order to grasp this amalgamation of violence, Kurz tied capital to the political, took seriously the notion of world interior politics, and reframed them from a Marxist point of view. The result of this were 439 pages in the sound of sectarian prose. They contain, however, a rational core, which can be reconstructed as follows and is which is interesting to be considered. So the argument is like this. Originally, domestic policy was a matter of the state. From a Marxist perspective, in turn, the state cannot be understood in isolation from the function it serves bourgeois society. This means that the domestic politics of the state remains inextricably linked to the ratio of the capital. In line with this, Friedrich Engels coined a strange term to refer to the state. In German, called the state ideeller Gesamtkapitalist, or ideal total capitalist. This he defines as the organization which bourgeois society adopts in order to sustain the general external conditions of capitalist production against the protestations of the workers and some few capitalists. Interior politics is one way in which capitalist production is sustained. Once politics is no longer confined to the state, but enters the arena of global interior politics, the global mode of production seems to require something similar on a worldwide level. For this reason, Robert Kurz changed the concept of ideal total capitalist to the concept of the ideal total imperialist. He thereby connected his concept to that of the imperialist stage of capitalism, which expanded the national economy to that of global capital. At the same time, he outdoes himself by claiming that after 1990, the imperial powers are subordinated to global interior politics. An ideal personification of the total imperialist capital now arranges the world order in order to sustain the conditions under which the capitalist mode of production is possible, in opposition both to the people whom the capitalist mode of production exploits, as well as the particular capitalist endeavors that damage those conditions to further their own interest. What does this concept mean for our reflections thus far? Obviously, an ideal total imperialist can no longer be a state. Neither, however, can it be a Großraum. For if we recall Schmidt's argument, a Großraum remains an imperial space among other imperial spaces. Accordingly, the ideal total imperialist must implement the global order against all individual powers, be they rods, racket states, state cartels, or Großräume. Simultaneously, it must offset this order's faulty functions. And last not least, it must successfully secure this order against the wreck of the earth. Such a global interior politics is not peaceful. It is realized rather as a world order war, a Weltordnungskrieg. It makes visible the invisible hand of the ideal total imperialist, which is nothing else than the contradictio in adjecto of a supranational state power. In order to arrange the world, global interior politics is necessarily connected to state apparatuses. Thus, particular structures make universal claims and operate in contradiction to their own particularity. Moreover, the order of the Großräume is not gentle. Its state cartels include and exclude, and it allows individual states seek the profit and rackets regard the world as prey. For this reason, the ideal total imperialist must display violence too, which does not abolish global violence, but rather multiplies it. Furthermore, world capital, which knows no bounds anymore, exploits even its own conditions of possibility. Far from being self-sufficient, it must therefore hold itself afloat by violent means. And last not least, the wretch on the earth see no longer an alternative, for the socialist Großraum was defeated. Thus, there's nothing left for them to do but lash out, both at others and themselves. All this sets a permanent contradictory campaign into motion. By it, the ideal total imperialist seeks to rid itself of its particularity and raise itself up to the universal in order to arrange the Großräume, the state cartels, the individual states, the rackets, and the wretched, all in the name of a global society. The global politics of interior peace leads thus to war. Our starting point was the inadequacy of the old picture of liberal hegemony of right on the one hand and the spheres of interest of the great powers on the other hand. Departing from it, Großräume operating with an existential friend-enemy distinction, as well as Großräume operating with an essential friend-enemy distinction, the global civil war of the liberal and the socialist Großraum, and lastly, the world order war of world interior politics established themselves. Where now do we stand? In the case of war in the Ukraine, different facets overlap. Firstly, conflicting Großraum relations asserted themselves. There was the clash between the Russian Großraum and the Großraum of the European Union, which had for years been torn between collaboration and conflict. There was the anti-Russian, anti-French, and anti-German project of a Großraum stretching from Poland to Romania, Intermarium project, which was to include the Ukraine. There was the support of this project by the United States of America, which included the arming and regime change of the Ukraine. There was the conflict between the US Großraum and the European Großraum as loggerheads in terms of economic competition, material resources, and geopolitics. And there was the conflict between the United States Großraum and the Russian Großraum. In Eastern Europe, the formation of the Großraum order remains precarious and torn between existential and essential arguments. For secondly, the Großräume are characterized both by existentialism and essentialism. In this respect, the war in the Ukraine has brought clarity. Despite conflicting Großraum relations, unity was quickly established by means of a shared friend-enemy distinction. We are fighting a war against Russia and not against one another, former German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said in the Council of Europe. Her sentence was not an international declaration of war, but rather a determination of the enemy. This determination has both an existential and essential side. Existentially, Russia appears foreign, irrational, death-driven. Essentially, it appears authoritarian, illiberal, unlawful. Both sides are prone to coalesce. And thirdly, these issues must be understood within the context of a world order war. Global capital is also always at stake. The figure of the ideal total imperialist is of use in this regard. This figure must, however, first be freed of its distortions. For Kurz, the ideal total imperialists were the United States and the NATO. This is in line with the representation of the United States as the main driver of global capitalism. In regard to the war in the Ukraine's wish to join the NATO, as well as the NATO's northeast expansion, appear to equip and strengthen the executive of world interior politics. And this reinforcement is met with Russia's prescient wanting to oppose to this world interior politics. But this conception is too simple. It rests on the reified concept of the state. Nikos Poulantzas' theory of the state had shown instead that the state is a compact field of class factions full of conflicting alliances and disputes with the ever uncertain hegemony of a power bloc, which is forced to mediate itself both with the ruling and the oppressed class. The old Marxist concept of a total capitalist was thus provided with a much more fitting formulation. The same can be said for world interior politics. The ideal total imperialist, too, constitutes a precarious web of global and national classes, states, alliances, and conflicts. Surely the United States of America and the NATO remain its representations most easily recognizable, supported by United Nations resolutions and international courts of law. These do not, however, fully exhaust the concept of the ideal total imperialist. Rather, it continues to evolve incessantly and precariously within global relations. Such a constellation also seems to determine the war in the Ukraine. It should be observed there how, in the battle with records, dysfunctional states, drugs, and war-torn conflicts, the power relations of the ideal total imperialist kept struggling and rearranging themselves. On the way to Maidan in 2014, to the protocols of Minsk, until the outbreak of war in 2022. With the begin of the war, the power bloc has rapidly solidified. It presents the war as a world order war, and its social hegemony also appears to have been secured, at least in North America and Europe. In other parts of the world, however, things look different. And that in turn makes the world order war uncertain as the further evolution of the ideal total imperialist itself. Accordingly, the precarious force formation in Eastern Europe intertwines with the precarious hegemonial politics of the precarious ideal total imperialist. And this means that the war in the Ukraine is connected to a both crisis-prone and violent world order war. Let me resume. The discussed categories, from Schmidt's Großraum to Kurt's world order war, are historical categories. They cannot, however, be confined to historical succession. The Ukrainian isolation, rather, shows how they become layers of uncanny simultaneity. They hereby become sediments within our social formation. This amounts to the intensification of crisis. The times are not a-changing. Instead, the West's victory crisis is intensifying. 30 years after the triumph over state socialism, world order politics seeks to shape the globe in its image and has produced ever more violence in the attempt. This demonstrates that our times must be grasped by means of a framework in view of totality. All the merely particular points of view which disregard the total formation inadvertently become factors in the crisis. In more concrete terms, they lead to existential as well as essential friend-enemy distinctions and all their consequences. These sediments, therefore, together constitute the conditions of war. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Gunnar Hinrichs. Many thanks. Discussion is open for Q&A. Please.
Mhm.
About what?
Yeah, I understand the question, I think, yeah. Your point is, and I think I have to admit that to you, the point is that my perspective is directed towards general features, right? General layers, neglecting the basic wheel of history, so to speak, namely human practice, perhaps better human practice than human action. And so the question is, where's human practice here? Yep. That's a very good point, to which I don't have a very good answer. But so let me instead of explain what I try to do. So of course, you cannot do everything in a short essay. So for me, it was necessary to get at grasp with the concept that could articulate the mess in which we are, or in which the international situation is. And I try to argue that these are structural concepts. Let's call them structural concepts. They are not practical concepts, but structural concepts. And usually these concepts are considered to be either opposing or excluding each other, or at least historically succeeding to each other, right? So the Schmidtian tale, for example. First, we have the genesis of the modern state with their international relations. Then we have, with the monodoctrine, the first Großraum. Then we have to create a new Großraum in Europe, a new Großraum order in Europe. Then after 1945, this all collapsed, and we have now to we only have these two big Großräume, which are ideological Großräume and not anymore existential Großräume. So there's, so to speak, a historical succession in this state. And what I want to argue is that these different layers must be understood as simultaneous aspects of a really messy situation, and help us to articulate this messy situation from a point of view. But I grant you, without any hesitation, that ordering these concepts and these structures do not, neither in a positive nor a negative way, determine human action and determine human praxis. They help us to understand. They are, it's like a Hegelian point of view, not towards the future action, but looking to the given, or to what is there, and to understand. Though I would say it is important to have a grasp at what is there, right? To have a grasp of what is actual in order to proceed further. Does it make sense to your point? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Could you make your last point a bit more clearly to me? Hmm? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Ah, I see. Mhm. Mhm. Let me reformulate your points just to check whether I got it correctly. So your point is interesting picture, but something is missing, namely the rise of populism in the last 10 years or so, right? And and this is an important aspect, an important feature of our situation. So how to fit in this feature in the proposal that I tried to develop, right? Yeah. Okay. Good. I don't have a. I would argue that these movements or these yeah, let's call it a movement. It's not really a movement, but these alterations or these changes belong to the problem that I pointed at the end of my talk, namely to the problem that we need, not we, that the state is not to be considered or that power is not to be considered as assigned to a certain institution simply or assigned to a certain group or so, but as a interplay of different forces in which a certain block forms out, right? And I would say that these populist ideas, which surely have to be articulated much more, but that these populist ideas are part of this, so to speak, power relation field in which they take place and in which they behave. And so from there, I would look at these phenomena and in order to integrate it to this field. Does it make sense or is it? Yeah, okay. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It seems to me that Mhm. 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 Yes. Going back to the question, find this convergence, right? Mhm. On the yes. Mhm. Mhm. And third one is the reason to look at is uh, times growth. Yes. Yes. It's very interesting that we should be start thinking along those lines. Different overlap Russia, those yes, yeah. It's Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. 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 Thank you. That's difficult to answer. Very interesting. Um, I I will pick the easiest question, namely the second, the relation to Negri and Hart's empire conception, and in contrast to the ideal total imperialist, right? I think um, the main difference between both is that the concept of empire, as Negri and Hart put it forward, includes the concept of the multitude. And it's not thinkable without the concept of the multitude. And that so to speak, that there is always is an anarchic round of power that can, so to speak, turn things over and bring forward things never been thought of before, something like that, right? And this is for Kurzkitsch. He calls it, this is the Disneyland of the multitude, right? For him, this is, so to speak, this has to do with the disappointment of these groups with their projection of that the working class is, so to speak, putting forward the revolution of capitalism, which never happened. And so there was the disappointment, and then they gave up these beliefs. And I thought, for him, this is just, so to speak, abiding by the old dream that there is an instance that could be the power of transformation. So that's the main difference between both. The difference is that the Weltordnungskrieg, the World Order War, is something that doesn't have a counterpart of same global extension. Yeah, so these two conceptions are clearly distinct from each other. Okay. Give me the last question was about the diasporic nations, right. The interesting thing is in China itself, there seems to be a discussion and very positive Schmidt reception. Using Schmidt's Großraum concept in order to speak about the Chinese Großraum, right? And the Interventionsverbot, the interdict of the interventions of raumfremde Mächte, right? Especially the United States. And so there is an active Schmidt reception in order to strengthen the Chinese project. Your point is interesting because, in fact, I think it has to do with the fact that these Großräume, as already the Großräume of the United States and so of the West and the East during the Cold War, are, so to speak, not, unlike the Schmidtian Großräume, are not bound to soil, to the ground. And that was, for Schmidt, the main objection towards the American project. Right? There are these weird, let's say, fascist ideological moments in his argument where he distinguishes between. That's right, but Land and Meer, right? land and sea was always an opposition that he abided by, and so there might be a difference. So we have to use his concept in a different way in order to make sense of these new phenomena. I cannot give you a good explanation on how to deal with Pakistan or other countries. For me, it's interesting to see that also I'm obviously do not only work as Schmidt saw it in terms of existential friend enemy distinctions, but also of essential, right? So that they can that they have that they have an essential distinction, and by that the concept of a Großraum is already post-Schmidtian in a certain way. Convergence of the right and the left, difficult, uncanny topic. One could say the argument is a convergence of the right and the left as well, because I used the right theorist, namely Schmidt, and I used the left theorist, namely Kurz and others. But you, of course, have something else in mind. And I wonder whether it makes sense to speak of a convergence of these two fields, or whether we better should speak of vanishing of a difference, something like that, so that it doesn't make sense that there's the right and the left and they converge, but there are neither left nor right. It's something else that. Mhm. Yeah. The rising right. Against both. Yeah, I mean, but from this point, I mean, this kind of argument would never use terms like elite or stuff like that, because this is much too less casted in socioeconomical terms, right? And so there might be still a difference between these terms. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I use liberal as a placeholder, I have to say. I know it's bad practice, yeah, and it's a placeholder because I didn't want to say civil/bourgeois society, right? That would be the more honest term. Yeah, in German we have perhaps we have a different use of the word too. When we speak of liberale Gesellschaft, liberal society, or so, we mean something different than what is meant in the in the English-speaking world, and often in other countries too. Mm-hmm.
Please, yes. Yes.
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Thank you very much. That's a bit, of course, concerns one of the central concepts here. Perhaps I should, so the term is difficult to translate. If we translate them verbally, we would say it's a large space, the Großraum. Yeah, this is what it means literally. But when the term came up to denote metropolitan areas, you can, for example, say there's the Großraum of Athens, right? It's a large metropolitan area. So there's Athens and there might be, and they all form a Großraum. And this Großraum is structured by certain functions. For example, a certain economic exchange, certain organization of traffic, certain other functional interconnections. And they form these metropolitan area or this larger space, the Großraum. And Schmidt, so originally it came from economic theory in the 20s and city sociology and so on in these years. And Schmidt picked it out and in order to use it completely different. He wanted to have a international organization beyond the states, or in his terms, beyond the liberal state, namely in the sense of a constitutional state that are sovereign subjects of international law. Right? And the Großraum is centered around a organizing power, not so to speak, erasing the differences, but organizing it towards this central functional unit. The idea was, of course, political. It was the concept was coined in the 30s, 38. So it was the idea that there's the European Großraum centered around Germany. Yeah, and this is then a Großraum. But the special point in Schmidt's argument is that a Großraum is not bound to certain normative claims, whereas he said certain essentialist claims. What does it mean to speak? What does the notion essence here mean? It means that you give a certain content first, and you organize something around this content. You can ask the question, what is it? And then you can give an answer to it, for example, the construction of a certain kind of society or so, and then you organize it. No, in Schmidt's eyes, it is existential. It belongs to a certain existential self-determination of a people. And this existential self-determination is the distinction between enemy and friend, the friend-enemy distinction, or friend-foe distinction, depending on the, yeah, and all contents are, so to speak, in the second line. So we have an this was the Schmittian idea. On the one hand, a very modern concept of the organization of the international space that is not bound to the state and its constitution and the Pax Westphalica concept of equal international subjects. There's a hierarchy in the Großraum. There's a center. Certain people is the center of the Großraum. And on the other hand, an existential foundation of it and not an essential foundation. That's the idea. Does it make it more clear? It's a very weird idea because it mixed these modern idea of a functional organization and of a existential decision in the end. Yeah. These nation states have to step back in the second line. And this is, you know, Schmidt was a legal scholar. So for him, it was interesting. He wanted to be he wanted to coin a new kind of right system, or a new kind of international legal system. And this concept should play a crucial role in this new legal system, which, of course, argues for certain political projects of the 30s. It's so to speak more basic in a certain way. The, perhaps it's easier to understand what it shall serve, what the concept shall serve. The idea was to say we can accord for different spheres in the world as different in terms of different Großräume. And these different Großräume can live together in peace as long as they accept that they are different Großräume. That is, they depend on different existential decisions concerning friend and enemy. This is the first side. The second side is that there's a clear subordination of areas and peoples towards the dominating people in the Großraum. That's why, for example, the Chinese Großraum would be a Großraum in which the United States don't have to get in. Dominated by the Chinese nomos, as well as Europe in the 30s should be dominated by the German nomos in the Schmidtian lines. But this is all pre-45. After 45, the concept changed. It became not so much the imperialist, that didn't have this imperialist side. It became more and more the idea that one must, so the fear is if you define the world order in terms of different ideologies, the different parts that belong to different ideologies can seldom live in peace together, because every ideology claims to be right. Whereas the Großräume can say, I'm the Großraum here, there's the Großraum there, and so we leave us alone as soon as you stay in your Großraum. That was the idea, which is problematic.
May I say something?
Yes.
Something I just want to clarify.
Yes.
Discuss. Starting with the point that there is a crucial distinction between existentialism and essentialism.
Yes.
It helps a lot to clarify what Großraum in terms of Schmittian conception of it really is or not. That's important, isn't it?
Yes, you have to make, you have to, so to speak, subscribe to the distinction between existential and essential.
In order to give, in order to understand what Großraum it Smith's theory actually means.
Yes.
I think that it may help in a way
And I mean, of course, this is a break with the tradition of international law.
This is exactly my point, because here in our country we discuss a lot of other parts of Smith's work, actually, the political concept, political theology, in which Vasily is an expert, but I'm afraid that we have not adequately discussed and in the needed depth works which have to do with his geopolitical function approaches, and the terms of growth around the term nomos, I would say it's the Greek version of growth. And what does it mean for international law? It's very important to understand Carl Schmitt's grasp of what the new international order should have been after the end. And I can very easily understand why our students have big perception. I think the problem is a bit, Vasily can understand it. I think that even our lawyers have to get more acquainted with that part of Smith's work. And I think that your lecture, although it was not a very easy one with all of our students, it was rather on the other hand, very complicated. And
one has to say, I mean, I would say I'm not a Schmidtian, to be sure, right? I mean, not that you think I'm a Schmidtian.
But you're somebody that knows
I try to
what actually Schmitt has.
I try to make sense of his, or I try to use this concept in order to make to get it with the situation. So one has to say that Schmitt is especially good in not clearing concepts, but not defining concepts, but bringing them forward and inventing them. You know? And that's a problem. And
he was not a theory builder as Hans Kelsen.
No, not at all.
But he was quite the opposite. But as you say, he was very clever in coining terms, both political philosophy and law. Very yeah, it's something at the same time. So somebody then would like to ask something. That's
yeah. Yes. So if I understood you right, you want to say the self-reflection of a Großraum could be a step out of the malaise in which we are. Yeah, yeah, that would be the idea, right? Oh, okay, I see. I'm not so sure because I think that it would be something else than the original conception if it were like this. And the original conception aimed, let's put it in another way. One of the core ideas was of the conception was we have to avoid to consider our enemies as criminals and rogues and so on. Only then are we able to make peace with them, right? Otherwise, we would treat them as a criminal that has to be brought to prison or in front of the International Court of Law or wherever, right? And so then we don't, then we cannot make peace with the enemy. So we have to punish the enemy if we see the enemy as a criminal or rogue state, or whatever. But what is necessary in order to see the enemy not as a criminal, if I understand myself as the institution of justice and right, then I have to understand, then I necessarily have the inclination to understand my enemies as people who are violating justice and right. And I cannot make peace with them, because then I make peace with someone who is injustice and violating the rights. So the only way to make peace with the enemies is not to consider oneself as the institution of the right and the just, but to understand oneself as one arbitrary decision according to what Schmidt called the being, right? This is existentialism. It's a version of existentialism. Existence precedes essence. This is existentialism. And existence on the state level means the existence of the political unit precedes the essence of the political unit. And the essence of the political unit is the existential self projection or self-creation of that unit. Not existential self-creation, essential self-creation. That means self-determination in essential terms. That's like in the individual essentialism, existentialism. This is on the political level. And if you argue like this, then you can say there are different existing entities that are not distinguished from each other by essential reasons, and therefore they are able to make peace with each other. That's the idea of the Schmittian account. What is not included in this account is that it presupposes, so to speak, sheer existence as unformed or bare of any essential or of any essential determinations or any essential definition. And this is a general philosophical problem, whether you can speak like this, because you have, so to speak, the idea of a bare existence without any content that then creates all the content. Yeah, so that's I think the philosophical problem. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And Mhm. Oh, why? Yes. 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 Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I thought that this idea would be, so to speak, already included in the framework in a certain way, that because if you think that there are different layers which are determining the conflicts, the international conflicts, then the idea of proxy wars are of course included in these layers. So if you say there, for example, I said there are different Großraum conflicts in the Ukraine. The conflict between the United States and Russia, but also conflicts of the European community and Russia, but also conflicts within the European community. So there is already a mingle of problems that have to do with the formation of this Großraum, right? And I would propose to say proxy wars are part of this mingle. Is that in your online with your thought, or? Mm? I would say yes. Yeah. No, right. This, I mean, it's not, so to speak, that So it's not the easy picture that we have clear-cut Großräume, right? There are different Großräume that are overlapping sometimes, and that makes it difficult to distinguish.
All right. Sorry, we don't have much more time. I just take advantage of my function as a moderator for a closing question. But very shortly, you can say something like they are two interrelated. So your greater point, like it's the subversive argument goes like all this gross logic, this big extension of the essentialist. It produces the opposite of what it aims at.
Right.
That's the thing.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, but because we're all aim at.
Thank you for pointing this out again.
Okay.
It was a bit lost in the discussion.
Okay. So, but then, because quotes refers to that, and to make a bit of advertising for the book, not advertising, it interested me a lot. Can you say something about this point, which I found very interesting? So, it's the following that you say in the book. So we aim at peace, okay?
Yeah.
But peace is like a kitschy object somehow in secular contexts, okay? Or that was quotes on the point that it's difficult as war theorists or sound more attractive in a way, whereas peace is not really, it's difficult to be thematized in not only context. If you could say something about that, about the thing we're aiming, why is peace so difficult to thematize?
I think you can thematize it, of course, but I'm not sure whether philosophy has the means to thematize it in a good way. If you look at the classical texts, let's say Kant, you will find a subtle irony when he talks about peace. He takes it very, very serious, but at the same time, there's an ironic sound around it, ironic air in its talk. And the idea is, I think that there is, I put the cards on the table now. I think a full-fledged account of peace would be a theological one, and not a philosophical. And when philosophy speaks about peace, there are sometimes these, let's say, kitschy overtones. So philosophy can speak more in a negative way, in criticizing war, right, or attacking war, not in giving pictures or images of peace. That's the theoretical sense. And yeah, does it make sense?
Yes. All right, we reached 8 o'clock. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Gunnar.